Obviously, I've put that picture up there to provoke you. Some of us in the room predate all of these standards that we're talking about today. We predate developer-funded excavation. We kind of had to make it up as we went along to start off with. That is a real box. It's got no objects in it anymore, of the way that things used to happen prior to potentially PPG 16. So a variety of any kind of cardboard, tin, or any other receptacle contained within a really rubbishy corrugated cardboard box. And I bring it out every year to show students at university in Bristol when I talk to them about archives and how things have actually moved along, because they have moved along. As much as we aren't agreeing with each other, potentially in particular areas, we do agree that we have to be better than this. I thought I'd give a little bit of context to the museum kind of like approach to all of this from a museum perspective. So quite a lot of museums across the UK are accredited. We have to meet particular standards in the way that we operate. Our professional practice is governed by an accreditation process. Accreditation covers all different kinds of policies, activities, etc., etc., etc. And obviously everything that we do as museum archaeologists within museums always comes back to, are we meeting our accreditation standards? What do we need to do to achieve those? And apart from professional practice and developing professional practice so that we are being the best that we possibly can be, accreditation is a really important thing for museums because it unlocks funding. If you are not accredited and you are not achieving certain standards, it's really difficult to go to third-party funders in order to be able to unlock the money to do other things. So accreditation underpins everything we do. You can see I've provided links to all of these things because there's a huge amount of reading that will come out of today's session, I think. One of those standards is to do with documentation, clearly. We have 9 primary procedures within museums, and in order to be able to achieve accreditation, we'll be using Spectrum version 5. And so UK museums need to achieve all of those. It doesn't necessarily have to be computerized. It can be a paper-based thing. But one of those primary procedures is to do with entry and exit of objects, including archives, and also the documentation that goes with them. And I'm glad that Rhonda mentioned the box word, because it's not just about box sizes. It's about what we actually do and how we can relate where that material came from and have a paper trail or a documentary trail of how it ended up in the museum, and also what we can do with it in the future. So there is a whole procedure to do with labeling and marking of objects and what that looks like. And actually relatively recently, I was approached by a sector group asking me, was it really necessary to mark all the pottery? And I did refer them back to what Spectrum said. So Spectrum actually used to have a whole section in it, particularly about archaeology. It's now slightly more generalized. We did write some stuff with it. There's a whole thing in there that enables some flexibility within this, but it does come down to what the museum requires in terms of their deposition guidelines. So underpinning whatever we want to do as museum archaeologists, we are fundamentally working in museums, and we still need to meet these requirements as well. And that includes ethics. So we have ethics that govern what we do. Museums Association has a code of ethics. It's out of consultation for some changes at the moment. So you can imagine that we're involved with ethics, particularly to do with human remains, but we're also involved with ethics to do with disposal or discard or retention, whichever terminology you want to use. But the ethics about what we do, how we make this material available, what we do in terms of engagement, that is also something that governs what we do as museum archaeologists, particularly with finds and archives that come into the museum. So we have to have an ethical approach. And then, of course, I said just now, some of us predate what was happening in terms of development control. I remember in the late 1980s, the first time that Bristol Museums was on the receiving end of an archive that had not been produced by archaeologists that were based in the museum. So those archaeologists who were field archaeologists that have been based in the museum obviously used the same size boxes and labels and standards as we did, but suddenly we were faced with an external organisation wanting to give us an archive. And how did we actually tell them how that could come to us? And was it sustainable? And actually that archive turned up in corrugated cardboard boxes with toilet paper, tissue, wrapping objects. And I spent about 6 months repacking the entire 200 boxes that had come in order to get it on the shelves, because obviously it was the wrong box size, but also so that it met our conservation requirements and our labelling and documentation system. And so actually our standards at the museum in terms of deposition started off as a two-side, one piece of A4, two-sided typed document, which said, this is what we really need in order for you to help us sustain this process, to receive the material that's coming in. And then obviously things have developed over time. Duncan produced 2007 towards an accessible archaeological archive, etc. Museums did actually have a standard that was written in the 1990s. And then obviously we've got European guidelines as well. So the archiving side of things produced their standards. And I'm just going to say something here, because one of the things I wrote in answer to the question was about this importance of collaboration. So seeing things from other people's perspectives, it's a big thing in museums, obviously, but understanding what your problems are and what our problems are, what the shared solution might look like, is a really important thing. In the Southwest, we ran this project. It was funded by an Arts Council grant. There were about 100 archaeologists that sat in a room of all different kind of like flavors. Boxes came up, but we talked about who held the power, if you like, to enable things to happen in better ways at what point. You know, so the requirement for things to be written in at the written scheme of investigation, and how that works, what happens to us. And we ran this project about sustainability and sustainable solutions. And I think for those of us that were in the room that day, we really started to understand each other's perspective and how we might be able to accommodate that or modify. And I think that's one of the most important things that perhaps can get out of today, is to understand that we're all trying to achieve the same thing, which is making sure that people can continue to learn from and have access to the archaeological resource. So shooting onto the Society for Museum Archaeology 2020, this is available. It's free to download. It's 71 pages, you can see. It is not prescriptive in those 71 pages. There are some things where it says, this is what you should do. These are the laws that you need to be mindful of. But most importantly, it is signposting to 200 sources and resources. We did a huge mapping exercise at the beginning of this process. We sat down, we talked to people, we gathered lots of guidelines from other areas. We saw how that kind of like integrated with each other. And then we produced this document, and clearly it was published just before lockdown. It wasn't written necessarily for people just like me. It was written for people that didn't know anything about the process, because our work within SMA had shown that about 50% of people that were curating archaeological material in a museum setting were not archaeologists. And so we have to be mindful of them as well. And so it's written in really easy language, and we were trying to enable people to understand. And that means anybody who doesn't work in a museum, anybody who's not trained as a museum archaeologist. So within that, obviously, we do have guidance on particular kinds of objects. We produced 14 fact sheets at the time. This is a growing series of a number of fact sheets. That's just the one. We commissioned other people to write these. So these have been written by a conservator. One of them does include labelling and marking. And we will be adding to these series as well. So there are a whole series of downloads about what you can, or maybe you should think about considering doing. And then also there's a whole chapter on archives. And I just decided that I would pull out these two, because these signpost to all of those things that we need to be mindful of and where we fit into the process in terms of archiving standards and what we do with that material when it comes into the museum. And as you can see, each one of those has a hyperlink, which means that every time you write new standards, somebody from SMA is now going to have to edit this document, because that's what we need to keep up with. We need to keep up with all the changes and anything new that comes out in order to be able to keep people informed. So we made it an editable document, and it will be revised, because to be honest, the previous version of this was brought out in 1992. And sadly, I read a written scheme of investigation just a couple of weeks ago, which I had a long conversation with Duncan about, which was referencing standards from 1990 and 1992. This was from a professional archaeologist. It wasn't a registered organisation. And I think that's the other thing that we need to, that, you know, you need to know, that we don't just deal with registered organisations. And it's who are these standards governing the work of, or leading people to better professional practice. So I will be speaking to that unit and talking to them about more up-to-date guidance that we've got. And then, of course, there's the legislation. So apart from standards and guidance, we also have legislation, thou shalt do this. And I sit on the Treasure Valuation Committee. I'm part of the Portable Antiquities Advisory Group. I chair the Museums Group for Portable Antiquities. And obviously, we were part of the consultation process for the revision of the new Code of Practice. So the new Code of Practice, I thought it was a really important thing to bring up just here, because there is a new piece of guidance that will be coming out for everybody regarding a new category of treasure. And that category is based on significance. And I've put a picture of the Crosby Garrett helmet just there, because that's the one that starts most of the conversations off about what ought to be in a museum, because the Treasure Act is designed to enable things to end up in a public collection more than anything else. And it defines how that process happens, but it doesn't catch everything. So there have been other designation amendment orders. There was one in 2002 that included prehistoric material, for example. But there are significant objects that have come out of the ground that ought to be in a public collection or accessible for research that are not captured in this way. And there's been a huge amount of work being put into defining how we might capture those things or enable a museum at least to express an interest in acquiring such objects. So Crosby Garrett helmet is the one that a museum did not acquire because it went for auction and it sold for something like £2.3 million. There are other examples of these kinds of things that happen all the time. So there is a treasure designation amendment order 2023. And this is what it says. So this is a significance test. It's a little bit like the Waverley criteria for export. It will potentially include things that you as field archaeologists potentially, or find specialists, will get into your possession because you're working on them. They might not be recognised immediately. And there are things that we would automatically usually say to a finder, single gold coins, nah, they're not treasure because they're not covered. They could be if they are rare or significant in terms of a region or a type. So single gold coins are the ones which will probably trip most people up. And then the other thing to bear in mind is it does apply to finds made during archaeological excavations. And I've put that little figure just there. He's a chap from Chelmsford. He just looks like a copper alloy figure, but those of you who know who he is, he's wearing the Birrus Britannicus, which is a particular kind of clothing. That's the first and only time that that's appeared on any of those figures. So he's not just a copper alloy figurine. He's a really significant figurine. He was found in 2014. Somebody tried to take him to export in 2015, went through the Waverley criteria. It is now in a museum. But the thing to bear in mind is that some of these finds will come out of the ground during archaeological excavations. You may not know that they are significant until they've gone to post-ex. But the requirement to report those finds is still the same. So you will still need to know that. I had hoped by the time we came to do this talk today that the new guidance that I've been working on with DCMS and various other people, including other representatives from other parts of the UK, would be out, but there is a new guidance in there. It explains exactly what significance threshold is. It's a really high threshold. You know, in my lifetime in Bristol, I can think of maybe 3 times that objects have come out of the ground that I would want to explain. You have to explain to the coroner as well why it is significant. But the guidance, when it comes out, has got case studies in it. So it gives you specific examples of how significance threshold might be met by objects. So that's my quick run through of what standards and guidance are out there at the moment, what changes we need to be mindful of, and how we all need to work together. Thank you.